I told my family they could have everything I owned, and for the first time in years they smiled at me like I mattered. The words surprised them, but not as much as they surprised me. For months after my husband Harold passed away, the house had been quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like a clock that had stopped ticking but no one had noticed yet. The old farmhouse sat on 3 acres outside Burlington, Vermont, surrounded by maple trees that had watched my life unfold for nearly 40 years. Harold and I bought this place when Daniel was still a little boy, who ran through the yard chasing fireflies in the summer evenings. Back then the house was full of noise, screen doors slamming, laughter from the kitchen, the smell of fresh apple pie cooling on the counter. But time has a way of thinning out the sounds of a home. After Harold's funeral, the silence stayed longer than the guests did. For weeks I waited for Daniel to stop by. I waited for the familiar rumble of his pickup truck in the gravel driveway. It rarely came. When it did, he stayed only long enough to ask if I had started thinking about arrangements. He never said the word inheritance directly. People like Daniel and his wife Vanessa rarely say things directly. They circle around them gently, like shoppers examining something expensive before deciding whether it's worth taking home. Vanessa was always better at hiding it. She arrived with a soft voice and bakery boxes from town, setting them carefully on my kitchen table, as if kindness could be wrapped in wax paper and tied with string. "You shouldn't be alone out here so much, Margaret," she would say, glancing around the house with the careful curiosity of someone measuring the size of the rooms. Her eyes lingered on the grandfather clock Harold restored himself, on the walnut cabinets, on the framed photograph of Daniel at age 10 holding the biggest trout he had ever caught. I noticed everything. Age does that to you. People assume the older you get, the less you see. In truth, you see more because you have nothing left to distract you. One evening about 3 months after Harold passed, Daniel thought I couldn't hear him talking in the hallway while Vanessa stood beside him. The kitchen door was open just enough. "Once everything's settled," he said quietly, "we could sell the land. Developers are already building closer to the highway." Vanessa answered in a voice just as soft. 3 acres that close to town could be worth a fortune. I stood by the sink holding a dish towel, looking out at the backyard where Harold had planted 2 young maple trees the year we celebrated our 20th anniversary. They were tall now, taller than the roof of the house. And in that moment something inside me became very clear and very calm. People think revenge feels hot and angry. Doesn't. Real revenge is quiet. It arrives like a thought that finally finishes forming. The next time Daniel visited, I poured him coffee in the blue ceramic mug he used when he still lived here. Vanessa sat across from me at the table, smiling politely. I folded my hands and looked at both of them. "I've been thinking," I said. "You're right. It's time to settle things." Daniel leaned forward immediately. Vanessa's eyes brightened in a way she tried to hide. "I've decided you should have exactly what you've been hoping for," I continued. Neither of them spoke for a second. Then Daniel smiled, the kind of relieved smile people show when a long wait is finally over. Vanessa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Margaret," she said warmly, "that's very generous of you." I nodded slowly and looked toward the living room where Harold's photograph rested above the fireplace. "We'll have the lawyer come next week," I said. "Everything will be written down clearly." Daniel's shoulders relaxed as if a heavy weight had been lifted. Vanessa began talking about how nice it would be to help take care of the property. They spoke about the future as though it had already been signed and sealed. I listened quietly. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the maple trees Harold planted years ago. Their shadows reached all the way to the porch steps. And for the first time since the funeral, the silence in the house no longer felt empty. It felt patient. I knew the moment Daniel and Vanessa left the house that afternoon that word would travel quickly through the rest of the family. News like that always does. When people believe money is about to move, conversations begin to spread faster than wind across dry grass. The following morning my phone rang before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. The screen showed the name of my niece Laura, someone who had not called me in nearly 2 years. Her voice sounded cheerful in a way that felt carefully practiced. She asked how I had been doing since Harold passed away, and whether I needed help with the house. I thanked her politely and told her everything was fine. Later that same day my nephew Gregory sent a message asking if I would like company for dinner sometime soon. Gregory had always been friendly enough when he was younger, but adulthood had slowly pulled him away like a tide moving farther from shore. Now suddenly everyone remembered that I lived alone in a large farmhouse sitting on 3 quiet acres outside town. I noticed the pattern quickly. Within 3 days 3 different relatives had reached out. Vanessa arrived again that Thursday afternoon carrying a large casserole dish covered in foil. She set it on the kitchen counter with a bright smile and said she wanted to make sure I was eating well. I thanked her and offered her tea. We sat at the same wooden table where Daniel had done his homework when he was a boy. She spoke about small things at first. The weather, traffic near the highway, a new bakery opening downtown. But every few minutes her eyes drifted around the room again. The grandfather clock. The antique cabinet Harold restored one winter after a heavy snowstorm kept us inside for days. The land outside the window where the maples stood tall and steady. Eventually she cleared her throat gently and asked whether I had already spoken with the lawyer. I told her I had called him that morning, and that he would be coming the following week to read everything clearly. Her shoulders relaxed when she heard that. Daniel arrived shortly afterward, walking through the front door with the same confident energy I remembered from when he was younger and thought every problem could be solved quickly. He poured himself coffee without asking and sat down across from me. For a few minutes the 3 of us talked about nothing important. Then Daniel leaned forward slightly. I recognized the look on his face immediately. It was the same look he used when he wanted something but preferred not to ask directly. He told me he had been thinking about the property and how difficult it must be for me to maintain such a large place alone. He mentioned that developers had been buying land closer to town, and that selling the acreage someday might be the sensible thing to do. Vanessa nodded quietly beside him, as if she had not already heard that exact thought spoken in the hallway weeks earlier. I listened carefully and stirred my tea. The spoon made a soft sound against the ceramic cup. When Daniel finished explaining his idea, I simply nodded. I told them both that I understood their concerns and that they would not need to worry much longer. I reminded them that everything would be made official when the lawyer arrived. Daniel smiled again, the same relieved smile he had shown a few days earlier. Vanessa squeezed his hand under the table, thinking I did not notice. Outside the afternoon light moved slowly across the yard, touching the long shadows of the maple trees Harold planted decades ago. Those trees had grown patiently year after year without asking for anything. I thought about that while Daniel and Vanessa discussed possible renovations the house might need someday. They spoke as if the future had already been signed and handed to them. I let them talk. There was no reason to interrupt. The plan was already in motion, and the quiet part of revenge is that it works best when everyone believes the story they want to believe. I spent the next few days preparing the house in ways that Daniel and Vanessa would never notice. Not because I needed to clean or rearrange anything, but because routine has a way of calming the mind before an important moment arrives. Each morning I woke up just after 6, the same way I had for 40 years while Harold was still alive. Old habits stay with you long after the person you shared them with is gone. I made coffee in the same small metal pot we had used since the 1980s and carried the cup out to the back porch where the air smelled faintly of wet leaves and distant pine. Vermont mornings are quiet in a way that makes every sound feel meaningful. A bird landing on the fence. The distant hum of a truck on the county road half a mile away. I would sit there looking at the maple trees Harold planted on our 20th anniversary, remembering how small they were when he first pushed the shovel into the soil. Now their branches stretched far above the roofline, steady and patient, the way time itself seems to grow when you stop paying attention. On Tuesday afternoon I drove into town to meet with our lawyer Harold Benton. He had known Harold and me for nearly 25 years and his office sat on the second floor of a modest brick building across from the courthouse. The waiting room looked exactly the same as it always had. 2 leather chairs near the window. A wooden desk with neatly stacked folders. The quiet ticking of a wall clock that reminded me of the one in my living room. When Harold Benton stepped out to greet me he smiled kindly and asked how I had been holding up since the funeral. I told him the truth. I said that time had given me clarity. He nodded in the thoughtful way good lawyers often do when they realize a client has already made a decision before walking through the door. We sat together at a long table while he reviewed the documents I had prepared earlier that week. He read each page carefully without rushing. Every few minutes he adjusted his glasses and asked one simple question to make sure the wording matched my intention. I appreciated that about him. Precision matters when people believe they already understand something that has not yet been fully explained. After nearly an hour he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. He said everything appeared perfectly clear, and that the reading could happen at my house on Saturday afternoon if that worked for me. I told him that Saturday would be ideal. By the time I drove back to the farmhouse, the sun had begun lowering behind the hills, casting long gold lines across the fields. Daniel called later that evening. His voice sounded eager even though he tried to keep it casual. He asked whether the lawyer had confirmed the meeting. I told him yes and that everyone was welcome to come by around 2 o'clock. Vanessa could be heard speaking softly in the background, asking whether he had mentioned the property survey yet. Daniel laughed quietly and said they would talk about that later. I listened without interrupting. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the kitchen counter and walked slowly through the house. Every room held a memory of the life Harold and I built together. The hallway where Daniel once measured his height with pencil marks on the wall. The living room where we hosted Thanksgiving dinners for nearly 3 decades. The study where Harold used to sit every evening reading the newspaper while the grandfather clock ticked steadily nearby. I paused in that room for a moment and looked at the framed photograph above the fireplace. Harold stood beside me in that picture, his arm resting gently around my shoulder, both of us smiling into the bright summer sunlight of a day that felt endless at the time. I told the photograph quietly that everything was ready. Outside, the wind moved softly through the maple leaves, making a sound like distant applause. Saturday was only 3 days away, and for the first time in many months the quiet inside the house felt completely under my control. Saturday arrived with the kind of quiet morning that makes a house feel like it is holding its breath. I woke before sunrise, the way I had every day since Harold passed, and walked slowly through the kitchen while the coffee brewed in the same small metal pot we had used for decades. Outside the windows a light mist hung over the field behind the house, softening the edges of the maple trees that Harold planted all those years ago. I carried my cup to the back porch and sat down in the wooden chair that creaked slightly whenever I leaned back. The air felt cool against my face, the kind of early autumn air that reminds you another season is already beginning whether you are ready for it or not. I stayed there for nearly half an hour, listening to the distant sound of a truck passing along the county road, and watching the mist slowly fade as the sun rose higher over the hills. Inside the house everything remained exactly as it had been the night before. The living room looked calm and orderly, the same room where Daniel once built towers from wooden blocks on the floor, while Harold pretended to read the newspaper nearby. The grandfather clock stood quietly in the corner, its steady ticking, marking each passing second with patient precision. At around 11 o'clock I began preparing the living room for the afternoon. I placed a few extra chairs near the large oak table so everyone would have somewhere to sit. I opened the curtains to let the daylight fill the room. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make the moment feel staged. A reading of a will should look ordinary. That is part of what makes the truth inside it so powerful. Shortly after noon Daniel called to say they were already on their way. His voice sounded almost cheerful. I told him that the lawyer would arrive at 2 o'clock exactly, and that there was no need to rush. Vanessa could be heard speaking in the background again, asking whether I had gathered the house documents. Daniel assured her that everything would be handled soon. When I hung up the phone I stood quietly for a moment and looked around the room again. The photograph above the fireplace caught my attention as it often did. Harold and I stood side by side in that picture, smiling at something outside the frame that neither of us can remember now. I walked over and adjusted the frame slightly so it faced the center of the room. At 1:45 a dark sedan rolled slowly into the gravel driveway. Harold Benton stepped out carrying his familiar leather briefcase, the same one he had carried for years whenever he visited the house for legal paperwork. He greeted me warmly and asked if everything was ready. I told him it was. We spoke quietly in the hallway for a moment while he reviewed the documents one last time. His expression remained calm and professional as always, but I noticed the slight pause he made when he reached the 3rd page. It was a small pause, the kind most people would never notice. But I noticed. At exactly 2 o'clock another car turned into the driveway. Daniel's truck followed by a smaller silver sedan behind it. Doors opened. Voices carried across the yard. Vanessa stepped out first, smoothing her coat as she walked toward the porch steps. Daniel followed close behind, glancing up at the house with the confident look of someone who believes the future is already waiting inside. Within minutes, everyone was seated in the living room. Daniel and Vanessa on the couch, two other relatives in the chairs near the window. Harold Benton took his place at the oak table and opened the leather briefcase slowly, removing a neatly organized stack of papers. The grandfather clock continued ticking steadily in the corner. For a moment no one spoke. Then Harold Benton cleared his throat gently and began reading the first lines of the document, his voice calm and measured as the quiet room listened carefully to every word. Harold Benton's voice moved slowly through the opening pages of the document, calm and precise, the way experienced lawyers read when every word has already been measured for its weight. The room remained quiet except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft rustling of paper each time he turned a page. Daniel leaned back against the couch with his hands folded together, trying to look patient even though the slight bounce of his foot against the carpet betrayed his anticipation. Vanessa sat beside him with her posture straight and attentive, her eyes following every movement of the lawyer's hands as though she expected the future to appear somewhere between the lines of printed text. The opening paragraphs described the usual formalities. My name. The date the document had been prepared. Confirmation that I was of sound mind and making the decision freely. Harold Benton read those sentences carefully, pausing just long enough between them to maintain the steady rhythm that legal language always seems to carry. No one interrupted. People rarely interrupt when they believe good news is approaching. After several minutes he reached the section that described the estate itself. He read aloud the details of the property outside Burlington, the 3 acres of land, the farmhouse, the personal belongings Harold and I had collected during 40 years of marriage. As each item was mentioned, I noticed Daniel's eyes briefly lift toward the window, toward the land beyond the maple trees, the same land he had already imagined selling to developers. Vanessa's fingers rested lightly on his arm, as if sharing the quiet excitement that both of them were trying not to show too openly. When Harold Benton reached the second page, he adjusted his glasses and continued reading. His tone remained unchanged, steady and neutral, as he explained that the estate would indeed be transferred to the family heirs exactly as requested. The words seemed to float in the room for a moment before settling into the comfortable silence that followed. Daniel let out a quiet breath he had probably been holding since the reading began. Vanessa's shoulders relaxed and a small satisfied smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. One of the relatives sitting near the window shifted slightly in his chair, as though preparing to congratulate someone. From the outside it looked like the moment everyone had expected. The moment where patience finally turns into reward. I sat in the chair beside the fireplace with my hands resting gently in my lap and watched the room carefully. No one was looking at me anymore. Their attention had already moved ahead to the part where ownership changes hands and the future becomes theirs to organize. Harold Benton turned another page. For the first time since the reading began his voice slowed slightly. It was not a dramatic pause. Just the smallest hesitation as his eyes moved across a particular line of text. His fingers remained resting on the edge of the paper for a moment longer than before. Daniel noticed the pause and leaned forward a few inches, curiosity briefly replacing his relaxed confidence. Vanessa glanced from the lawyer to the document, her smile still present but now slightly uncertain. The grandfather clock continued ticking in the corner with the same calm rhythm it had kept for decades. Harold Benton cleared his throat quietly and continued reading, explaining that the estate would be granted to the heirs with full rights of ownership, including the land, the home, and the financial assets associated with the property. Daniel's smile returned immediately. Vanessa squeezed his arm again, this time with a little more excitement. They believed they had reached the end of the story. But Harold Benton had not yet finished the page. His eyes returned to the same line that had slowed him earlier, and for a moment the entire room seemed to grow still again as he prepared to read the sentence that followed. Harold Benton's eyes rested on the same line for a moment longer before he finally spoke again. His voice remained calm, but there was a slight shift in its rhythm, the kind that happens when a sentence carries more weight than the ones before it. Daniel noticed the change immediately. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching the lawyer closely. Vanessa straightened beside him, her fingers still lightly gripping his arm. The rest of the room grew very still. Even the quiet movements people make without thinking seemed to stop. The only sound that continued without interruption was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Harold Benton adjusted his glasses and read the next sentence slowly, making sure every word was clear. He explained that while the estate would indeed be granted to the heirs exactly as described, the transfer of ownership would only become effective after a specific condition had been satisfied. The sentence was simple. Just one line printed in the middle of the page. But the effect it had on the room was immediate. Daniel's confident expression faded slightly as he tried to process what he had just heard. Vanessa's smile remained for a moment longer before slowly disappearing as well. Harold Benton continued reading, explaining that the condition attached to the inheritance required each listed heir to demonstrate a consistent record of personal care and support provided to Margaret Whitmore during the final years of her life. The document described this support very clearly. Regular visits, assistance with daily responsibilities, genuine presence during times when family connection mattered most. The language was precise, but the meaning behind it was simple enough for everyone in the room to understand. Daniel blinked and glanced quickly at Vanessa as though expecting her to interpret the sentence differently. She said nothing. Her eyes remained fixed on the document in the lawyer's hands. Harold Benton continued reading, calmly explaining that records had been maintained to verify whether these conditions had been fulfilled. Those records included documented visits, medical support appointments, household assistance logs, and several additional notes attached as supporting evidence. As the explanation continued, the quiet confidence that had filled the room earlier began to shift into something else. It was not anger yet. Not disbelief either. It was something closer to uncertainty, the uncomfortable moment when people begin to realize the story they believed might not be finished after all. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was careful, almost casual, as though he believed there had been some kind of misunderstanding. He asked the lawyer to clarify whether the condition applied equally to every heir listed in the document. Harold Benton nodded calmly and confirmed that it did. The requirement had been written intentionally to ensure that the inheritance would reflect genuine family care rather than simple expectation. Vanessa leaned slightly forward now, her posture no longer relaxed. She asked whether occasional visits or holiday gatherings would count toward the condition described in the will. Harold Benton answered with the same calm tone he had used since the beginning of the reading. He explained that the requirement referred specifically to sustained and meaningful involvement over time, not occasional appearances during special occasions. The room grew quiet again after that. Daniel leaned back slowly against the couch, his eyes drifting toward the window where the maple trees stood beyond the glass. Vanessa looked down at her hands for a moment, her expression carefully neutral. Harold Benton turned the page gently and prepared to read the final section attached to that condition. As he did, I remained seated beside the fireplace with my hands resting quietly in my lap, watching the room the same way I had since the reading began. Outside, a light breeze moved through the maple leaves, and the grandfather clock continued marking each second with the calm certainty that time always carries forward no matter what people expect to happen next. Harold Benton turned the next page slowly, the soft sound of the paper moving through his fingers filling the quiet room for a brief moment. Everyone was watching him now. The earlier confidence that had filled the living room had shifted into something tighter, something uncertain. Daniel's posture had changed completely. He no longer leaned back comfortably against the couch. Instead he sat forward again, his hands clasped together, his eyes focused carefully on the document as if trying to read the words before the lawyer spoke them aloud. Vanessa remained beside him, her shoulders held straight, her expression controlled but no longer relaxed. The rest of the relatives sitting near the window seemed unsure whether they should remain hopeful or concerned. Harold Benton cleared his throat lightly and continued reading the section that explained the verification process attached to the condition of the inheritance. His voice remained calm and steady as always. He explained that over the past several years, a simple but detailed record had been maintained documenting the presence of family members during important moments of daily life. These records included visit logs, medical support appointments, scheduled check-ins, and several written notes confirming when someone had offered assistance or companionship. Daniel frowned slightly as he listened. Vanessa glanced at him quickly, then returned her attention to the lawyer. Harold Benton continued explaining that the records had been compiled in a clear timeline to ensure fairness for everyone involved. The document did not rely on vague memories or assumptions. It relied on dates, observations, and documented moments of support. He paused briefly and then read the first summary line attached to the timeline. According to the records, during the past 3 years the number of documented visits from the primary heirs had been extremely limited. Daniel shifted in his seat. Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the couch cushion. Harold Benton continued reading calmly, listing a few specific examples from the timeline. One visit occurred shortly after Harold Whitmore's funeral service. Another brief visit had been recorded during the following winter holiday. A third appearance had taken place during the previous spring when Daniel stopped by to discuss possible maintenance costs for the property. Each example was read clearly and without judgment, simply as part of the record. The silence that followed each line seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice slower now, carefully measured. He asked whether these records were meant to represent the entire history of family contact. Harold Benton answered politely that the document only included the period specified by the condition in the will, the years during which ongoing care and involvement had been expected if someone wished to qualify for the inheritance. Vanessa leaned forward slightly and asked whether phone calls or occasional messages might also be included as evidence of support. Harold Benton acknowledged that communication could certainly be meaningful, but he explained that the condition described in the document referred specifically to personal presence and direct assistance, rather than distant conversation. The explanation was simple, but its meaning settled quietly across the room. Daniel's expression grew thoughtful as he looked toward the window again. Vanessa remained silent beside him, her earlier smile completely gone now. Harold Benton continued reading the final lines of the verification section, calmly explaining that after reviewing the full timeline the legal conclusion would depend entirely on whether any heir had met the clearly stated condition. When he finished that sentence he closed the folder containing the records and placed it gently on the table beside the will. The grandfather clock continued ticking in the corner of the room, marking the slow passage of another quiet moment. I remained seated near the fireplace watching everyone carefully. Outside the maple trees moved softly in the afternoon breeze, their leaves shifting with the same patient rhythm they had followed for decades. Inside the living room the atmosphere had changed completely, and everyone present could feel that the next few sentences would determine far more than they had expected when they first walked through my front door. Harold Benton rested his hands calmly on the table for a moment before opening the final section of the document. The room had grown noticeably quieter now, not because anyone had asked for silence, but because everyone seemed to understand that something important was about to be decided. Daniel stared at the table with a tight expression, his earlier confidence completely gone. Vanessa sat beside him with her back perfectly straight, though the tension in her posture was now impossible to hide. The other relatives near the window shifted slightly in their seats but said nothing. Even the air in the room seemed heavier, as if the house itself were waiting to hear the conclusion. Harold Benton opened the final folder and lifted a single sheet of paper from inside. His voice remained steady as he began reading the closing explanation attached to the condition in the will. He explained that after reviewing the documented timeline, the legal requirement had been evaluated with careful attention to fairness and accuracy. The condition had been written clearly so that anyone who had truly taken the time to remain present, to assist, and to support Margaret Whitmore during the final years of her life would be recognized accordingly. Daniel slowly shook his head as if hoping the conclusion might still change direction. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. She asked whether the records could possibly be incomplete. Perhaps some visits had not been documented. Perhaps someone had overlooked certain occasions when the family had checked in or offered help. Harold Benton listened patiently before answering. He explained that the records had been maintained carefully and reviewed multiple times to ensure their accuracy. Every documented visit had been noted. Every medical appointment where someone accompanied Margaret had been recorded. The timeline had been verified against appointment logs and household records. He paused briefly and then continued reading the final statement attached to the condition. According to the verified documentation, None of the listed heirs had fulfilled the required period of consistent personal presence and support. The words settled into the room slowly, like dust after something heavy has been moved. Daniel's eyes widened slightly as the meaning reached him. Vanessa looked down at the floor, her expression frozen in a quiet mixture of disbelief and frustration. One of the relatives near the window shifted again, suddenly unsure whether to remain seated or quietly excuse himself from the gathering. Harold Benton continued calmly, explaining that the document had anticipated this possibility and included a clearly defined secondary instruction. If none of the heirs met the stated requirement, the estate would not remain unassigned. Instead, it would pass to the individual whose documented presence had fulfilled the condition described in the will. Daniel looked up immediately. Vanessa's head turned sharply toward the lawyer. The silence that followed was complete. Harold Benton lifted the final page of the document and read the name printed at the center of the line. The estate of Margaret Whitmore, including the farmhouse, the land, and the associated assets, would be granted to Emma Rodriguez, the home care nurse who had assisted Margaret during her medical recovery periods and continued visiting regularly over the past several years. The reaction in the room was immediate but quiet. Daniel leaned back slowly as though the strength had drained from his posture. Vanessa stared at the lawyer, unable to speak for several seconds. The relatives near the window exchanged uncertain glances, realizing that the story they expected to witness had just changed direction entirely. Through it all, the grandfather clock continued ticking with the same calm rhythm it had kept throughout the afternoon. I remained seated beside the fireplace, my hands resting peacefully in my lap. Outside, the maple trees moved gently in the breeze, their leaves catching the afternoon sunlight in soft waves of gold and green. The house felt very quiet again, but this time the silence carried a different meaning. The truth had been spoken clearly, and there was nothing left for anyone to misunderstand. For several long seconds no one in the room spoke. The only sound was the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock, and the faint movement of maple leaves brushing against one another outside the tall living room windows. Daniel slowly leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees as if he needed to feel the solid weight of the moment before he could accept it. Vanessa's eyes moved from the lawyer to me and then back again, searching for some sign that the reading had not truly ended the way it had just sounded. Harold Benton placed the final page neatly on top of the document and folded his hands together with the calm professionalism of a man who had read many wills during his career. The sentence he had just spoken still seemed to hang in the air between everyone present. The estate would not go to the heirs who had expected it. It would go to Emma Rodriguez. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower than before, careful but unable to hide the disbelief that had begun to creep into it. He asked Harold Benton whether the instruction could be challenged or reconsidered. Perhaps the condition had been misunderstood. Perhaps the intention had been interpreted too strictly. Harold Benton answered the way experienced attorneys always answer when the language of a document is clear. He explained that the will had been written with precise legal wording and had been reviewed several times before being finalized. The condition was not vague. It described exactly what was required and exactly how the result would be determined. Vanessa slowly shook her head, as if she were still trying to rearrange the pieces of the story in her mind. She asked whether Emma Rodriguez had known about the condition while she was caring for me. Harold Benton answered honestly that Emma had not known about the inheritance clause. Her visits had never been part of any agreement or expectation of reward. She had simply continued to check on Margaret Whitmore because that was the kind of person she was. The explanation seemed to settle over the room in a quiet and uncomfortable way. Daniel looked toward the window again, his expression thoughtful now rather than confident. Vanessa sat back slowly against the couch, her hands resting quietly in her lap as she stared down at the carpet. The relatives near the window exchanged brief glances, clearly unsure whether there was anything appropriate left to say. I remained seated beside the fireplace, watching everyone with the same calm patience I had carried throughout the entire reading. After a moment, Harold Benton turned his attention toward me and asked gently whether I wished to add anything before he closed the meeting. I looked around the room once more, taking in the familiar faces and the house that had held so many years of my life. The sunlight coming through the windows had shifted slightly, casting long warm shadows across the floorboards Harold Whitmore had installed decades earlier with his own hands. I spoke quietly but clearly so that everyone could hear me. I explained that the will had never been about punishment or embarrassment. It had been about something much simpler. Family is not measured by who expects to inherit a house or a piece of land. Family is measured by who chooses to show up when no reward is promised. Emma Rodriguez had shown up again and again during years when the house had grown quiet and the days had sometimes felt longer than they used to. She had brought groceries when the winter roads were icy. She had driven me to doctor appointments when my car needed repairs. She had sat at the kitchen table drinking tea on evenings when conversation mattered more than anything else. None of those visits had been dramatic or important in the way people usually describe big family moments. But they had been real. When I finished speaking, the room fell silent again, though this time the silence felt different. The tension that had filled the air earlier had slowly softened into something more thoughtful. Harold Benton gathered the pages of the will and placed them carefully back into his folder. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, just as it had every afternoon for years. Outside, the maple trees swayed gently in the late sunlight. And inside the old farmhouse, the story had finally reached its quiet and honest ending.